Hello and welcome to the Apartment Academy podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Cunningham. The Apartment Academy podcast is the multifamily industry's only operations-focused podcast, which features insights from industry leaders, investors, vendors, and technology providers. So if you invest in multifamily real estate or you're involved in day-to-day on-site operations of apartment buildings, we are your source for efficient operations and maximizing ROI. Today's guest is Maria Pietroforte, who had very interesting things to say about a subject that's really near and dear to the hearts of many that are in day-to-day on-site operations, which is dealing with very difficult, dare say, toxic residents. There is a method to that that you are going to be very interested to hear in order to keep yourself out of trouble and resolve things in hopefully a way that makes everybody happy. So let's listen in. Hi, Maria. Welcome to the Apartment Academy podcast.
Hi, Daniel.
So, Maria, you have a very interesting background. I think that it's worth sharing with our listeners before we jump right in today. Will you mind telling us a little bit about how you came to be in the position you are today?
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to do that. Well, first of all, many people think that I have a Cinderella career. And how that came to happen is that I always took on the difficult tasks. I was a problem solver, and I became president of a management company in California before I was ever a vice president. And that doesn't happen that often in the industry. From there, I faced different vertically integrated companies. I love the development side. So I have been president of management companies on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and those that had a footprint all the way up to Alaska. Additionally, I was president of RentNet, which then turned into Move.com. So I've crossed over to the supplier side and back again.
There's probably not much that you haven't seen in terms of issues and challenges in multifamily operations. But we're going to talk about something very narrow today, but which still I'm guessing is probably maybe the number one most common source of friction, most common source of demoralization in property management, which is, and I want to preface this by saying this is minority of people that live at apartments, but we have toxic residents. I mean, it is a business. One of the unique things about being in property management is you are dealing with a cross section of humanity, and you are going to have all kinds represented in that cross section, and some people are difficult for a number of reasons. And then we're not talking about people that just have problems and they want you to solve their problem, but we're talking about people that are really adversarial in nature. And as a community manager, it's your job to stand and try to diffuse those situations, to work things out with a person like that, to hopefully they leave feeling like they were heard and that their problem's been addressed. But that is not easy. And so as one of the more difficult challenges, having someone with your experience coming up to make some suggestions and talk a little about that, I think is super valuable. So let's start off, just some examples of areas where this becomes a problem, some examples of toxic residents coming into play and how those are dealt with.
Well, first of all, I always say every apartment community has that one resident, that one special resident that we need to go to the hair salon and have our hair dyed after.
Not me, but.
I think that the common one is when the resident thinks there's something wrong in their apartment, and let it be mold, that's a popular topic, and they tend to exaggerate. So they'll either get on the phone or come in to your office and get in your face, so to say. And they always like to say that I've called you 50 times and I've reported this 100 times. And we know that that's not true. We know that we've taken maybe 3 calls, 3 work orders, and we've sent somebody out there timely. and their story is exactly the opposite. Usually they will end up threatening us in some way, especially with social media nowadays. So they're kind of coming at you through a lot of different things. And I think the first thing that I can suggest to anybody that takes that call is that you need to calm yourself down. So there's different strategies, first of all, but always calm. So deep breath, get a pad out. Always have a pad and a paper, whether you're on the telephone or you're in person, because this forces you to not say anything and to take notes. I think the biggest mistake that we make is that we want to defend ourselves and we want to tell them that they're wrong. They only called us 3 times. Don't do that. You need to just listen. Listen to what they have to say and take notes. If you can do that and stay calm and take the notes, they're going to vent on you. And then you can ask them when they're finished venting, thanks for sharing that story with us. What would you like us to do? And then see what they say. So that's a fairly easy one with a fairly simple conclusion, but we can go into some deeper ones.
Yeah, I think that's probably what you just described. Many property managers would call that Monday. Right? Yeah. Like that's just almost a daily occurrence. Things can be more confrontational than that, right? You can have residents that are right. So talk a little about that. You're in a situation with somebody that's really not maybe rational or reasonable. How do you contend with a situation like that?
Well, the first thing that I do, and let's make this example that they're in your office, because that's when it seems to scare people. A lot of people what they do is they tend to want to take this really crazy resident into their office. I highly recommend that you don't do that. Many times that's our instant thinking is let's get them behind a closed door where everybody doesn't hear them. My recommendation, first of all, is to keep them public. That allows you with a little bit of safety, but it's also, people don't like being ugly when they're in front of others. So it may naturally cause them to tone it down a little bit. So things that you need to do when somebody is like that is you slow your pace of talking. So talk slower, which for me, that's always a stretch because I'm animated and I'm hyper. But talk slower, talk lower so that they have to focus on listening to you. That starts to calm them down. Be at the same level. If they're standing, you're standing. I would try to get them to sit down, and I'm pretty assertive with these things. I would sit right next to them. You don't want to sit across with a barrier in between you. I love to pull up a chair right next to them where I'm almost knee to knee because I'm in their personal space, and that usually helps deflect some of that negative energy. Now, a couple things that I always tell my teams that we won't tolerate is if they're threatening us or if they're cussing at us, I'm going to ask them, if you don't mind, can we just take this down a notch? I really want to hear what you have to say, even though you know that there's maybe no result and there's really nothing you can do. They just like to come in and complain and they're always unhappy and, there's something going on. But I take it down. And again, I always take notes and I'm going to let them know I'm going to take notes because you're really important to me. And I want to make sure I get everything down. So those are just a couple things. I tend to see managers wanting to call the police and threatening people. I don't like to do that. I think that makes things worse. I do think if you need to close off the conversation, you may need to say that, this isn't a really good time for us right now. Why don't we come back when we're less emotional? Now, you're taking risks with that in saying it, but you need to come to a conclusion if they're just not going to be someone you can deal with. So I always try to keep it on the positive side. But it doesn't always go that way. So you may have to ask them to leave, and then you may need, to call your regional, the police, whatever. It just depends. The other thing is, if you do have any type of guards at your property or security type of personnel, and or even a maintenance manager that you can trust, that you feel more comfortable with somebody like that around, have them just be lingering in the background.
Is there, what were your policies, or what do you suggest the policy should be at properties where residents are belligerent, are verbally abusive? I was sitting in on a discussion earlier this week where it was a round table of property managers talking about this, and it really ranged from zero tolerance. If somebody abuses part of the staff, we evict them, to on the other side of the spectrum was, well, we give them warnings, and then we give them written warnings, and then we do, and I think probably the answer is somewhere in the middle there. I think that it's probably, it's not against the law, and it's probably to be belligerent, to be a jerk. And it's probably not something you can evict people for. I don't think the judge would take kindly to that. But just how much leeway do you give residents to be verbally abusive to the staff?
How I typically handle that is, I like to first of all remind myself that we're all human and that we're all possibly flawed, and we don't know what else is going on in people's lives. So I like to come at it from a solution orientation. I want to solve this and have a happy ending. Maybe I'm, a little bit too much in love with the white picket fence syndrome, but our job is to provide wonderful customer service. So when we get somebody that's continually like that, if I'm the on-site manager, I typically want to step it up one, and I will usually suggest bring in your regional manager. Maybe the two of you sit down with this individual and talk. Now, at companies that I've worked on, those are the type that I love to take. It's the really difficult person that nobody seems to be able to settle down. To me, that's my favorite, because I want to try to provide a happy conclusion. So I like handling those. But what happens with that is that, again, we're trying to create harmony, if at all possible. So once we've gone from the site to maybe a regional or somebody else, trying to, in a sense, mediate the scenario, not saying that there's fault on one side or the other, but just trying that one more time before we start giving notices, thinking about eviction and those things, because that's not what we really want to do. So I like to have one more conversation. And in that conversation, prior to actually the manager and the regional, or whoever the two people are, we should talk about possible outcomes. What possibilities can we offer this person to see if we can make this a happy place before we say you can never come to the office again and all of that. And I've had all those things happen. So many times the conclusion is that I am so sorry, we're not going to be able to make you happy. This just doesn't seem like the place for you to call home. So why don't we do this? You've paid your rent. Would you like to move out by the end of the month, and we'll waive any notices. We're not going to charge you a lease break fee, and we could part ways and have a start over, you with a new home and us with a new resident. And it still keeps it.
Yeah, well, that would be win-win for everybody.
Yes. And that's what I think you want. I think we have to be careful that too many times it's all about the rules, and it's not about the person, and it's not about the social media press you're going to get on it. So I like to always think it through.
Speaking of rules, there are fair housing guidelines that are in place to prevent, one person from being treated differently than another because of their race, color, creed, sexual orientation, etc., familial status. These discussions, I think, sometimes can be misconstrued as possibly right? Possibly violating kind of a fair housing agreement if any one of those protected class characteristics comes into the discussion. What would you coach around that particular pitfall of dealing with residents?
Well, first of all, I highly recommend, that every management company absolutely puts their team members through fair housing training on an annual basis, not just one and done, when you start. I'm a firm believer in that. It helps to protect the company and it keeps everybody educated. So now that I've said that,
yes, table stakes.
Yeah. We need to be careful in the vocabulary that we use, and some of that is just like, you can't say you, or, there's certain ways that you don't want to talk to somebody that's going to either give them the opportunity to file a fair housing suit or give them the impression that you're treating them differently because of some factor about themselves. So I think that companies need to do role playing with these type of scenarios. I'm a big role player. Put two people, and how I like it to be done, Daniel, is you and I would be sitting back to back so we're not looking at each other and having the conversation, because that's more like on a phone call. And then we would be standing up in front of the room and acting it out. You have that belligerent resident come in, and we're going to have that belligerent resident actually be throwing out some of the discriminatory things so that our response back isn't. And all, because it is about our vocabulary. There's so many words nowadays that somebody may think that you're insinuating, they're in a class that should be protected. So
you have to even be careful what pronouns you use these days.
Absolutely. And that's the whole thing. Like, you people, you shouldn't be saying. You've got to be careful if you're saying mothers or women. It's a lot more difficult nowadays.
It's a tightrope. And how do you, because there can be a lot riding on these discussions, what do you suggest in terms of documenting those interactions, sort of providing some backup that in those instances where it goes beyond into some kind of lawsuit or fair housing complaint, what should be the best practices in terms of documenting these kinds of interactions?
You need to document in your software so that it'll be there forever. So every conversation that you have with a resident needs to be translated into a memo, into whatever software you're using. That's first and foremost. I'm an apps, whether you're on the phone. Now, what I used to do is when I would go to a property and take care of one of these calls, I would actually sit at their computer with people watching me do it. I'd have the screen pulled up on the computer and I'd be taking notes on the computer while I was talking, because I'm a big believer in you've got to document. Now, if you've got one of these people that we're talking about, the really, the ones that we see as potentially risky, whether it's a lawsuit or whatever else they might be getting into, I sometimes have a witness, just like you would if you were dealing with an employee scenario. You always have two people.
Yes.
So in a scenario where the person is highly volatile, I would have two of you, and you both sit down. Now, one of them might be sitting across and one is a little bit closer. If it feels okay to do that. Never act adversarial, try to be kind and professional. That way, again, you're diffusing it already. You've got to watch your tone and take great notes. I've had somebody once try to record it or film it. Don't do that. It's not permissible by most companies. It's not allowed, and it's just not ethically a good scenario. But take notes, have both of you taking notes. And then again, translate them into their resident file. And I highly recommend not a paper, but in the computer system.
Yes. Yeah. That all sounds ideal. And at what point earlier you mentioned, trying to come to a good conclusion before taking other steps. One of the steps that I heard you mention was talking about banning them from the office.
Well,
is that a reasonable approach if things can't get resolved by the white picket fence methodology?
In my mind, no, because what you're doing is you're treating them like a child on detention or restriction, and that's never going to produce a good outcome. It's going to backfire on you, but properties do it. I had one at a company that I recently worked at do that. And I think they did it because the person was drinking too much coffee in the office. I just don't think that that's the right I don't, again, in every company, every leader might have different twists on things. I come from a people orientation. My loyalty first and foremost is to my team. Through my team, we're going to be wonderful service operators, to our end customers. But, my job is to make sure that my team is equipped, they're safe, they're feeling good about their job and our decisions. But again, when it comes to restricting them from the office, for me, I wouldn't suggest that. I just don't think you're resolving anything.
For their, what would they imagine is the ideal outcome of this discussion?
It's pretty interesting when you ask that question. It's the question that we tend to forget to ask. Right.
And if they come up with something that sounds, doable, well, then they've solved the problem for you, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Now, as we were saying earlier, we do deal with a cross section of people, and from time to time, that means that you will encounter mental illness, and that's I have had some personal incidents where we had residents that were clearly had mental illness, needed help. At what point, Maria, do you, as a property manager, do you reach out to the police and as kind of a last measure, if you have somebody that you suspect, well, if maybe they've made threats, or B, how do you deal with somebody who might be mentally ill?
Well, first thing that I would do is I pull out their resident file. I want to see what's in there. I want to see who their emergency contact is. I'm also going to talk to upper management and find out, what are you comfortable with me doing? Is there, so that we fully vetted everything. I've had that scenario often. That is not an uncommon one nowadays. So whether it's mental illness, drug addiction, alcoholism, abuse, there's all sorts of things like that. If there's somebody in the file that we're allowed to contact, then we may want to reach out to them. Again, it all depends on, how your policies are, how your paperwork is. The other thing that we've done is we've actually reported them to local authorities on health, mental health. There's a lot of agencies that you can call to have them try to help them first, before you call the police. So if you think about it, just like when a resident experiences something tragic in their life, we tend to go out, whether it's to the Red Cross, to a charity, to try to get help. I come from that place. Can I help them? Not that I'm going to be their counselor, their mother, their doctor, anything like that. But you do have resources to try to connect that first. Now, again, if it's security and danger, then you may have to go the police route. But I would definitely first engage in some type of a mental health organization that might be able to come in and basically meet with the person and see. Many times they need to go into special housing, or live in a community that is equipped to help them.
That must be a sticky situation as well, because, you have we are guardians of personal information for our residents. We're not allowed to disclose. So the ability to go outside to an organization and say, we feel we may have somebody who's, could use your services is potentially mentally, that must be fraught with peril as well. And probably something that should be discussed internally before those steps are taken with senior management.
I absolutely recommend internally, whether if the company has an in-house lawyer, your lawyer, but definitely vet it, into the corporate office. You need to have it well documented and know what you're going to do, because there's also HIPAA regulations that, we don't know a whole lot about, but we do know doctor patient and all of that. So we want to be careful, with that scenario. We also don't want to be accusing somebody of having mental health issues.
Right. Right.
It's so delicate. So to me, I always think that if you do things out of love, heart-centered care, but smart, tactical, procedures, that combination, I think, levels us out. So we're still thinking about people first, but we're following, a specified process that provides some protection for the company. Because as a manager, your job is to prevent liability and bad press, for your company. So it gets touchy. Managing apartment communities nowadays is much more complicated from a human aspect than it used to be. There's so many new things that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, one of those things that people from outside the industry wouldn't really understand. You said something I want to follow up on, which is you could reach out to a contact if you have permission. Is there a best practice you would suggest to multifamily operators to make sure that that permission is expressed somewhere? How do you discern and make it clear that you have permission to reach out to an emergency contact in a situation like that?
Gosh.
I mean, I'm thinking like from a paperwork standpoint, Maria, like how do you...
There's two places that information is usually documented. Either on the application, many times there's emergency contact, or somewhere in the leasing, paperwork when you're first getting them to move in, you're asking for phone numbers and things like that. So what I would say, and I'm not sure that there's a little waiver that says we have permission, to contact these people. I can't remember that, because how often are we really thinking in advance? But that's the two places I would look. The third scenario would be, again, in your software, is there a checkbox? But just because we checked the box, it doesn't show that they gave us permission. We may have checked the box on our own. So that's an interesting one. I'd have to think that through, and look at, every state's different too, in their lease format, depending on your state, there could be something different, and your application could be different. I don't know whether everybody's using, NEAs or what they have. So the scenarios, it's definitely I like that. I kind of want to know now. So don't be surprised. You and I can work on that and figure it out.
Sure. Well, I'll share it on another episode. It's one of those, look, it doesn't happen enough that people like you and I know the answer off the top of our heads. But like when it happens, you'd like to have a process in place. Let me switch gears on you a little bit as we kind of wrap up. And let's talk about the emotional impact that all of this weighs on operators, the community managers, the service managers who are on the receiving end of this. How can companies support them? Because it is a lot. It's a job unlike, I think, almost any other, that you're expected to, wrestle with, the accounting and the leasing, but then there's this emotional component that not everybody is really well girded to support. So how can companies support their managers through these kinds of episodes? What kind of self-care should managers be thinking about, service managers, to get through this?
Well, I'm going to start with the personal side for the person, breathing deeply, before and after those scenarios, kind of breathing in, and letting out the toxic experience that you just had, that there's an energy to that, even bringing your arms up, and down. I think that let's just pretend that we were in the office, or in the clubhouse, getting out and walking around the building, helps just to, with maybe some self-affirmations that I care about people. I'm a good manager. I want the best for everyone, just things that kind of get you back to centered. I think on the company side, it's really important that the support staff for the property teams are available. And it's the thing that I find is a miss sometimes, is that you can call your regional, text your regional, and they're busy, so they're not able to get back. But then maybe you can go to HR. There's always, HR should be a department that you could go to more or less talk about the scenario. That also gives you another way to document it. You've gone and you're kind of self-checking yourself, with it. You might take 5 or 10 minutes and go and listen to a podcast. Keep a daily, maybe affirmation book. I've got one. It's, positive affirmations for the highly effective professional. I have all sorts of those. You can keep it by your desk. There's cute calendars with it, and look at something that's uplifting and all. And just really, kind of give yourself a hug. It's not always easy, to navigate these scenarios. And I think that self-love, so to say, is really important. And it's one of those areas that I think companies are missing, is that human connection, that heartfelt, I care about you. I know that was a difficult scenario. What can I do to help you? Whether it's going out and getting a fun coffee, but give yourself a moment, even if you just have to go into your restrooms and sit and just, it's, you have to figure out what works for you. For me, and my dogs, but you don't always have your dog at work, so they help.
So speak for a moment then to the regional managers or the regional VPs for whom the community managers report and work for, what they can do to recognize because they're not always aware of what is happening on a daily basis, because some of this is de rigueur. So speak to them for a moment about how they can recognize this sort of sometimes silent, emotional burden that their management on site is carrying.
Well, first of all, I think it's important that you're interacting with your managers, if possible in person weekly, and that you're actually seeing every employee and asking them, how is everything going? Is there anything I can do for you? Because we forget to ask, and we don't always. I see so many regionals or directors make the mistake of, they go to a property and they sit in the manager's office. They're not walking around, they're not interacting with everyone else. So you don't know what's going on. You've, in a sense, partitioned yourself from the reality of what happens on the property. Now, again, guys, this is just my opinion and my experience. I think that you need to create a rapport to where your team, whether it's the manager or other employees, feel safe going to each other to say, hey, I just had a difficult conversation. Can you help me out? Just want to go over a few things with you, and I need a little love. That's, I think, what people need. That's how you keep your top talent with your company, right? Because they need to know that you care. Yeah. So it's being available, being approachable. And if you can't be, which I know we're busy and we have other things that are going on, make sure that they have a network of someone else that they can go to in your absence or when you're busy. So I tend to find that my days were typically not dealing with the things that I wanted to do, but making sure that I was available for team members. That's probably the most important thing we can do, is engage with our team and make sure that they have the tools and that we're listening to them.
Yeah. That's a great way, I think, to wrap things up. So important, really. One of the soft skills that helps make property management, I don't want to say endurable, but to help focus on the bright side of the property management. People that want to get more, Maria, you have so much to share, based on your background. How do people get in touch with you? If somebody wants to hear more about what you have to say about this subject or some of the others that I've heard you speak about, how do people get in touch with you?
Well, a couple ways. Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook. I also have a YouTube station. Now, here's the complicated thing. Nobody can ever spell my name. So my website and all of my handles are under Maria, like you might think it's spelled Pietroforte. That's the tough part. It's PIETROFORTE.com or Maria@MariaPietroforte.com. I'll give you a phone number too if you like. It's 805-422-4722. I want to help you. I'm here to help you. So, take advantage of that. I am a consultant, obviously. So, I provide services to help companies with these types of things. But I also like to know what's going on and what is important to you so that on my Monday Lives or when Daniel and I do things like this, we can help you.
Maria, thank you for sharing some of that wisdom with us today. We really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you. Hope we have a chance to do so again in the future. Okay, thanks for joining Maria and I today on this edition of the Apartment Academy podcast. If you have enjoyed listening to these podcasts and you feel like you could use some advice from some of the professors here at the Apartment Academy, then go to our website, apartmentacademy.com, and click Help Me. We'll send you a questionnaire and provide individualized responses to your answers at no charge that I guarantee will offer you insights on ways you can immediately improve apartment operations at your community. Thanks again, and we look forward to speaking with you next time.